The desert doesn't lie. It shows you exactly who you are. Stripped down, burned raw, with nowhere left to hide. No walls. No crowd. No name to hide behind. Just you, the sun, and the silence that presses down on your chest like a boot heel. And in 1887, a man rode into the town of Red Rock Hollow with nothing but a worn-out horse, a loaded pistol, and a name that even he had stopped believing in. They called him Cale Dryden. He wasn't looking for trouble. He wasn't looking for gold. He wasn't even looking for peace, because men like Cale had stopped expecting peace a long time ago. But he found something. Something he didn't plan on. Something that scared him more than any bullet ever had. He found a woman standing in the rain, holding a lantern with both hands, looking at him like she already knew every sin he'd ever committed, and had decided, for reasons he couldn't understand, that she didn't care. And before this story ends, you're going to watch a man tear himself apart trying to decide whether love is something a man like him even deserves. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Wherever you are, sending love your way. Now settle in, because this one is going to hurt in the best way possible. Red Rock Hollow wasn't on most maps, and the people who lived there preferred it that way. It sat in a shallow basin between two red ridges, like the earth had cupped its hands and let a little town pool in the center. The buildings were old. Not old in the charming way, old in the tired way. The wood had gone gray from years of sun and wind. The church had a crooked cross. The saloon had a missing door on the left side, replaced with a hanging strip of burlap that slapped against the frame every time the wind moved through. There were maybe 300 people in Red Rock Hollow, and every single one of them knew each other's business. Cale Dryden rode in on a Thursday afternoon in late October. The sky was that pale yellow-white that comes before a storm, when the air gets heavy and still and even the horses seem nervous without knowing why. His horse, a dark brown mare named Cinder, walked slow. She was tired. He was tireder. He hadn't slept in 2 days. Not because he couldn't find shelter, but because every time he closed his eyes, the same faces came back to him. A burning barn. A man on his knees. The sound a rifle makes when it echoes through a canyon and doesn't stop echoing for what feels like forever. Cale was 34 years old, though he looked closer to 42. His face was the kind that had been weathered by things that had nothing to do with weather. There was a scar that ran from just below his left eye down to his jaw, pale and thin, like a dry creek bed. His eyes were gray. Not the romantic kind of gray. The kind of gray that comes from looking at too many things you can't take back. He wore a black duster, dusty at the hem. 2 revolvers on his hips, both holstered but both worn in ways that made clear they'd been drawn more than most men drew theirs. His hat was pulled low, not because of the sun, just because he didn't particularly want to be seen. He stopped Cinder at the trough near the general store. Let her drink. Didn't look around too fast. That was a rookie mistake, looking around too fast. You let your eyes move slow and steady. You took stock. You learned the layout. 3 men on the porch of the saloon. None of them were talking. 2 had rifles propped against the rail. 1 was watching Cale with the kind of stillness that meant he'd already made some kind of decision. He just hadn't acted on it yet. A woman crossed the street ahead, young, moving quick with a basket of bread. Didn't look up. A boy of maybe 9 or 10 stopped on the boardwalk and stared at Cale openly, the way children do when they don't know yet that staring is dangerous. Cale looked at the boy. The boy looked back. Cale gave the smallest nod. The boy turned and ran. He tied Cinder to the post and walked into the general store. It smelled like dried herbs and wood smoke and something sweet, maybe molasses. Behind the counter was a man in his 50s with a white beard and round glasses pushed up on his nose. He was writing in a ledger. He didn't look up when Cale came in. Need a room, Cale said. No hotel in Red Rock. Still didn't look up. Know anyone who rents one? The man looked up then. He took in Cale the same way a man takes in a sky before a storm, measuring, cautious. Clara Voss rents a room. Far end of Maine. Yellow door. He paused. She don't take trouble. I'm not trouble, Cale said. The man looked at him a long moment. No, he said. That's usually what trouble says. Cale bought a tin of beans, a box of cartridges, and a bar of soap without another word. He walked out. The three men on the saloon porch were still watching. He didn't look at them. He walked Cinder down to the yellow door. He knocked, and when the door opened, a woman stood there in the gray afternoon light. She was maybe 28. Brown hair pinned up but coming loose around her face. An apron dusted with flour. Dark eyes that were calm in a way that didn't feel like innocence. It felt like someone who had been through a storm and come out the other side and decided to stop being afraid of weather. She looked at him, not at his guns, not at his scar, at him. "You need a room," she said. Not a question. "Yes, ma'am." She stepped aside without another word. And Cale Dryden, for reasons he couldn't explain, felt his chest do something it hadn't done in years. Tightened. Like something inside him was waking up that he had worked very hard to put to sleep. He stepped through the yellow door. And the storm that had been building in the sky all day finally broke open above the town. Clara Voss had lived in Red Rock Hollow her entire life. She had been born in this town, grown up in its dust, married in its church, and buried her husband in its cemetery. All before her 26th birthday. Thomas Voss had been a good man, quiet man, a farmer who grew wheat and fixed fences and read the Bible every night by the fire and never once raised his voice in anger. He had died of fever on a Tuesday, so quickly and so quietly that Clara had barely had time to understand what was happening before it was already over. That had been 2 years ago. She had stayed. Not because she had nowhere to go. She had a sister in San Antonio who'd written 3 times asking her to come. But something kept her in Red Rock Hollow. Maybe it was the house, which still smelled like Thomas in certain rooms if she stood very still. Maybe it was the cemetery on the hill where she went every Sunday and sat with him for a while. Maybe she just wasn't ready to start something new. She rented the spare room because it made practical sense and because the silence of the house had started to feel like a presence of its own. A heavy, watchful thing that sat in corners. She had rented to 2 men before Cale Dryden. The first had been a traveling preacher who spoke too much and borrowed $2 she never got back. The second had been a salesman who had been perfectly polite and had left no impression whatsoever, like water through sand. Cale Dryden was not like either of them. He was quiet in a way that felt heavy rather than empty, like his silence had weight. He sat at her table for supper that first night. She included supper in the price, always had, and he ate carefully. Not hungrily, carefully, like he was very aware of every movement he made. Like he was used to watching himself. She put biscuits and stew on the table. He said, "Thank you, ma'am." She said, "Clara." He didn't offer his name in return for a moment. Then, "Cale," just the one word, like he was testing how it sounded out loud. She sat across from him and ate. She wasn't the kind of woman who filled silence with noise. Some women did that, started talking about weather or neighbors or the price of flour just to cover the quiet. Clara had learned to let quiet be what it was. She studied him the way you study a piece of country you're about to cross, looking for where the ground was soft, where it was hard, where you might need to be careful. "What brings you to Red Rock Hollow?" she asked. "Passing through." "To where?" A pause. "Somewhere else." She almost smiled. Most people who come to Red Rock Hollow are either running from something or looking for something. He looked at her then, fully, the way people rarely look at each other at supper on the first night. "Which one were you?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "I was born here." "Neither." "And now?" She put down her spoon. "Now I'm just trying to figure out what comes next." He nodded once, like that was the most honest thing anyone had said to him in a long time. After supper, he helped her clear the table without being asked. She noticed that. She noticed he moved carefully through the house, like he was very conscious of the space he took up. Like he was used to trying to take up as little as possible. She showed him the room. Small, clean. A window that looked out over the back lot where she kept a small garden. A bed with a quilt her mother had made. A hook on the wall. He stood in the doorway and looked at it. "It's a fine room," he said, and the way he said it, it didn't sound like politeness. It sounded like something had landed somewhere in his chest and surprised him. "Rent's $1 a week," she said. Includes supper and breakfast. That's fair. House rule, she said, and she said it looking directly at him. Whatever you did before you walked through that yellow door, it stays outside. He met her eyes. Something moved in his, something complicated and deep and old. Yes, ma'am, he said quietly. Clara. She nodded and walked back down the hallway. In her room, she sat on the edge of her bed and pressed her hands together in her lap. She didn't know exactly what she had just let into her house, but she knew, the way women know things that don't have words yet, that something had changed tonight. Something small, something quiet, like a seed going into cold ground. You couldn't see it yet, but it was there. Word travels fast in a small town, faster than horses, faster than telegraph wire, almost as fast as fear. By the next morning, the three men on the saloon porch knew that a stranger had taken the room at Clara Voss's house. By noon, the man behind the saloon's bar, a wide-shouldered man named Dutch Pharaoh, had already decided he didn't like it. Dutch Pharaoh was not the sheriff of Red Rock Hollow. He didn't need to be. He was the kind of man who had built his power quietly over years by doing favors and calling them in, by knowing secrets and keeping them until the moment they were most useful. He owned the saloon. He owned the livery. He had a hand in the only mine operating in the ridges above town, a silver deposit, modest but real. He was 50 years old, with a big square head and the careful eyes of a man who had never done anything without calculating it first. He had also been courting Clara Voss for the better part of 6 months. Courting was perhaps too gentle a word. He had been pursuing her with the focused, patient certainty of a man who was used to eventually getting what he wanted. He brought her things: firewood once, a bolt of fabric. He had offered twice to hire a man to repair her roof. Clara had accepted the firewood and declined everything else. She was polite about it. Clara was always polite. But Dutch had told himself that she was still grieving, that she just needed more time, that a woman alone in Red Rock Hollow would eventually understand the practical wisdom of accepting the protection of a man like him. He had told himself this so many times that he had begun to believe it was simply the truth, the natural ending to a story still in progress. And then Cale Dryden rode in. On the second morning after Cale arrived, Dutch sent one of his men, a thin, snake-eyed young man named Rollo, to find out what he could. Rollo came back in an hour. He pulled his chair close to Dutch's table at the back of the saloon and leaned in. "Name's Cale Dryden," he said. Dutch didn't react to the name, but something shifted behind his eyes, just slightly, like a man who had been expecting bad weather and was now watching it arrive. "You sure?" he said. "Sure as I can be." Old Hennessy at the store heard him give the name. Dutch poured himself a glass of whiskey, drank it slow. Cale Dryden was not unknown to men who trafficked in the darker edges of the territory's history. He had ridden for a man named Garrett Cole 5 years back, a well-connected, deeply dangerous cattle baron who operated out of the northern range. Garrett Cole was the kind of man who used other men the way a carpenter uses tools. He picked up what he needed, used it hard, and put it down when he was done with it. The stories about Cale Dryden were the kind that got quieter and more careful the closer they got to the truth. Some said he had killed 8 men. Some said more. Some said he'd walked away from coal after a job went wrong. A ranch family, a burning, and that he hadn't worked for anyone since. Dutch didn't know what was true, but he knew a dangerous man when one came into his territory. "He say what he's doing here?" Dutch asked. "Passing through, far as anyone can tell." "Passing through," Dutch repeated. He looked at his glass. "Staying at the widow Voss's house." Rollo nodded. Dutch was quiet for a long moment. He turned the glass in his fingers slowly. "Keep watching him," he said. "You want me to run him off?" Dutch looked up. There was nothing warm in his eyes. There was something very cold and very patient, the way certain rocks in the desert are cold even in the heat of the afternoon. "Not yet," he said. "Men like that, you push them wrong, they push back harder." He stood. "Watch him, learn his pattern, and find out what it is he actually wants." What Cale Dryden actually wanted at that exact moment was to help Clara carry 2 buckets of water from the well to the house. He had seen her struggling with them through the window, had gone out without thinking much about it, had taken both buckets from her before she could protest. She had looked at him with those steady dark eyes. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said, and he carried them inside. That night she made cornbread to go with the supper. He ate 3 pieces. She noticed. And somewhere in the back of the saloon, Dutch Pharaoh sat alone at his table and thought about the long, slow way to remove something that was standing between a man and what he believed was already his. The storm outside had passed, but a different kind was building. A week passed, then another. Cale didn't leave. He told himself it was because Cinder had thrown a shoe and the blacksmith was backed up. Then Cinder was fine, and he told himself the weather was turning bad. There was ice coming down from the north, and riding in ice was asking for trouble. Then the ice came and went, and he was still there. He stopped making excuses, even to himself. He started doing small things around the property. Fixed a broken step on the porch. Replaced 2 fence posts on the south side of the lot. Stacked firewood against the back wall in a way that would keep it dry through the winter. Clara watched all of this with a careful, even expression. She didn't stop him. She didn't encourage him. She just watched. One evening, the 3rd week, she found him sitting on the back steps in the dark, not doing anything. Just sitting, staring at the sky. The temperature had dropped and his breath came in slow white clouds. He had his elbows on his knees and his hands hanging loose between them, and there was something in his posture that was different from the guarded, controlled way he usually held himself. He looked tired. Not tired from work. Tired from something that lived inside him. She brought out 2 cups of coffee and sat beside him on the step without asking. Handed him one. He took it. They sat without talking for a long time. Then he said, "You ever do something that you can't undo?" She didn't answer right away. She thought about Thomas. About the days before he got sick when she hadn't said certain things she should have said. Because she thought there would be more time. Because there was always supposed to be more time. "Yes," she said. "How do you carry it?" She looked at the sky. Orion was up. She'd always liked Orion. "You just carry it," she said. "There's no trick to it. You just decide you're going to keep walking anyway." He was quiet. "What did you do?" she asked. She expected him not to answer. She had learned that about him. He answered questions in his own time or not at all, and you couldn't push. But he answered. He told her about Garrett Cole. About writing for him for 3 years. About believing that Cole was a hard man but a fair one. That the work was rough but necessary. About the night Cole sent him and 3 others to persuade a ranching family to sell their land. A family named Whitmore. Father, mother, 3 children. He said the word persuade and stopped. He said that he had waited outside. That he hadn't known what the others were going to do. That by the time he understood, it was already happening. That he had pulled 2 of the men off and gotten the family out. That the barn was already burning. "The father looked at me," Cale said. His voice was very flat. He was holding his little girl. And he looked at me like, he stopped. Like I was the worst thing he'd ever seen, even though I helped them get out. Because I was still part of the thing that brought it to his door in the first place. Clara was very still. "I rode away from Cole the next morning," Cale said. "Haven't worked for anyone since." "That was the right thing to do," she said. "Didn't fix anything." "No," she agreed. "It didn't, but it was still right." He looked at her. Something in his expression broke slightly at the edges. Not dramatically, not with tears. Just a small, quiet fracture, like a crack running through stone. "I don't know how to be a decent man," he said. "I know how to survive. I know how to keep moving. But the other thing." He stopped. "I don't know if I know how to do that anymore." Clara looked at him for a long time. "You brought in my water," she said. "You fixed my steps. You fed Cinder hay from your own pocket without charging me for it." She paused. "You're already doing it. You just don't recognize it because it's quiet." He looked away. But she saw something move in his jaw. A tightening. Like a man trying to hold himself together from the inside. She went back into the house. Left him there with his coffee and his sky. and she stood at the kitchen window for a moment. Not watching him, just standing, with her hand pressed flat against the cold glass. She was in trouble, she thought. Not the dangerous kind. The other kind. The kind that comes when you realize you've started caring about someone and you can't remember exactly when it began. Dutch Pharaoh did not act out of jealousy. He told himself this. He acted out of principle, he said to Rollo. Out of civic responsibility. A man with Cale Dryden's history had no business settling in a quiet town like Red Rock Hollow. It was a danger to the community. It was particularly a danger to a woman alone, a woman who perhaps didn't fully understand the kind of man she was sheltering. Rollo listened to all of this and said nothing. He had learned that when Dutch explained his reasons at length, it was because Dutch was explaining them to himself. On a Monday, Dutch paid a visit to the sheriff. His name was Roy Hames. He was a decent man, too slow to be more than competent. He had held the position for 6 years without major incident because Red Rock Hollow was, generally, a quiet town. Dutch had always considered Roy more of an instrument than an authority. "There's a man in town," Dutch said. "Cale Dryden. You know the name." Roy did. He shifted in his chair. "I know of it. He's got a history," Dutch said. "Rode for Garrett Cole. Was involved in the Whitmore burning up in the North Range." Roy was quiet a moment. "I heard he pulled the family out." "He was there," Dutch said. "Whatever he pulled out or didn't, he was part of the crew that brought it to their door. That makes him complicit in my book." Roy rubbed the back of his neck. "He caused any trouble here?" "Not yet." "Then I can't run him off without cause, Dutch." Dutch leaned forward slightly. "I'm asking you to look into it. Talk to him. Let him know he's being watched. Men like that, they move on when they know they're seen." Roy was uncomfortable. He steepled his fingers. "I'll talk to him," he said finally. "But I'm not threatening a man who hasn't done anything." "Nobody's asking you to threaten anyone, Roy," Dutch said, with a smile that didn't reach those careful, cold eyes. "Just a friendly conversation." Roy talked to Cale the next afternoon. Cale was at the general store buying tobacco and a new set of bootlaces when Roy came up beside him, introduced himself, and said he liked to make a point of meeting new folks in town. Cale looked at him quietly. Roy talked for a few minutes. Asked where Cale was from, where he was headed, how he was finding Red Rock Hollow. He was careful and decent about it. Not aggressive. Cale answered the questions in short, accurate sentences. Then he said, "Dutch Pharaoh send you?" Roy blinked. Then he sighed. "I'm doing my job," he said. "I know," Cale said. He paid for his things and turned to go. Then he stopped. He turned back to Roy. "I haven't raised a hand to anyone in this town," he said. "I intend to keep it that way." He paused. "But if Dutch Pharaoh has got something he wants to say to me, tell him to say it himself. I'm not hard to find." Roy watched him walk out. That night, Dutch tried something different. He sent 2 men to the stable where Cale kept Cinder. Just to spook the horse. Just to send a message, the kind of message that said, without words, you're not welcome and we can make things difficult. Cale was there. He was sleeping in the stable. He'd started doing this some nights for reasons that were his own. He was a light sleeper. He'd been a light sleeper for so long that he'd forgotten what deep sleep felt like. He heard them come in. He stood up from the hay quietly, both revolvers in his hands before either man had time to process he was there. In the darkness, with only the thin light from a lantern one of them was holding, Cale looked at the 2 men very calmly and said, "You got a choice right now. Think carefully." The 2 men looked at each other. They left. Cale put his revolvers away and stood in the dark for a long time. He knew what this was. He had lived this pattern before, in other towns, other situations. He knew exactly what Dutch Pharaoh was. He knew exactly how this kind of thing escalated. He should leave. He knew he should leave. He thought about Clara sitting on the back step in the dark beside him. About the way she had said, "You're already doing it, you just don't recognize it because it's quiet." He pressed his back against the stable wall and tilted his head back and closed his eyes. He stayed. The confrontation came on a Friday. Not in the dark. Not in the shadows. In the middle of the day on Main Street, in front of half the town. Dutch Pharaoh had planned it that way. He walked out of the saloon at noon, when the street was most occupied, when women were doing their shopping and men were gathered near the livery and children were coming back from the schoolhouse, and he called out to Cale Dryden, who was crossing the street from the general store. Dryden. Cale stopped. He turned slowly. Dutch was standing in the middle of the street with Rollo on his left and another man. Bigger, younger, hands already loose at his sides, on his right. He was dressed well, as he always was. Hat pressed. Coat clean. He looked like a man who'd made a decision and was comfortable with it. The street got very quiet, the way streets in small western towns get quiet when everyone who's old enough has seen this shape of moment before and knows what it can become. "I want to have a conversation with you," Dutch said. His voice was even, confident. "In front of these people. Because they deserve to know what kind of man has been living in their town." Cale said nothing. He stood completely still. His hands were at his sides. He looked at Dutch with those gray eyes that gave nothing away. Dutch talked. He told the gathered townspeople about Garrett Cole. About the Whitmore burning. He told it in a version that placed Cale closer to the center of what happened than the truth allowed. He wasn't screaming or raging. That was the most dangerous thing about Dutch. He was calm, measured. He made it sound like he was performing a public service. When he was done, the street was very still. People were looking at Cale. Cale stood in the sunlight with the dust moving around his boots, and he looked at Dutch Pharaoh, and something in his expression was very quiet and very sad, in a way that was more painful to look at than anger would have been. "You done?" Cale said. "I'm saying you should leave," Dutch said. "Peaceably. Today." "Or what?" Dutch's expression didn't change. "Or things get complicated." Cale looked at the two men flanking Dutch. He looked at Rollo. He looked at the bigger man whose hand was hovering now. He did the mathematics in his head, the mathematics he'd been doing his whole life automatically, the way other men did addition. He could win this, even with two of them. He'd done harder. But there were people on the street. Children who'd come in from school. A woman with a baby on the boardwalk. He made a choice. He looked back at Dutch. "I'll go," he said. "But not because of you." And he walked away. He walked back to the yellow door. Clara was standing on the porch. She had heard. Of course she had heard. Sound travels in a small town. He could see it in her face. Not horror, not judgment, but something careful and searching and open, the way her face always was. He stopped at the bottom of her steps. He took off his hat. "I should pack my things," he said. She looked at him for a long time. "Cale," she said. "The things Dutch said." "I know what the things Dutch said are," she cut in, quietly but firmly. "I heard them, and I heard what you didn't say back." He was quiet. She came down one step, then another. She stood close enough that he could see the faint lines at the corners of her eyes that came from years of squinting into the sun. "Do you really want a family?" she asked. She said it very quietly. Just for him. The word family was not a soft word the way she used it. It was a hard, real, demanding word. Not an idea of one. Not somewhere far away that you're riding toward. A real one. Here. With all the ordinary mess of it. The work and the staying and the being known. He looked at her. Everything he was, everything he'd done, the roads and the fire and the men on their knees and the long, empty years of moving. It was all right there in his eyes for a moment, visible and unguarded in a way that would have terrified him if he'd known it was happening. "Yes," he whispered. "If it's with you." The word landed on her like warmth. She took his hand. She just held it. And that was everything. Behind them, at the end of the street, Dutch Pharaoh stood and watched from the saloon doorway with those cold, patient eyes. And the thing that moved through his expression was not rage. It was something more dangerous. It was the particular look of a man who has lost something and has decided, quietly, finally, that he is going to make the person responsible pay for it. He turned and went back inside. And the door swung shut behind him. The winter came hard to Red Rock Hollow. 3 feet of snow by December. The ridges disappeared behind white. The streets turned quiet. With smoke rose from every chimney in thin, steady threads against the gray sky. Dutch Pharaoh made his move on a Tuesday in January. He sent 4 men. He wasn't there himself. That was how Dutch operated. He set things in motion and stayed back and watched from behind clean hands. But the 4 men he sent had not met Cale Dryden yet. And when it was over, when the snow had settled again and the horses had stopped moving, 3 of the 4 were disarmed and sitting in the dirt, and the 4th was riding hard back toward town to tell Dutch that it hadn't gone the way it was supposed to go. Cale had not killed anyone. He had chosen not to. That choice, that specific, difficult, costly choice, was the truest thing about who he had decided to become. Roy Hames arrested Dutch Pharaoh the next morning. Took time. Took testimony. It took 2 months of slow, careful legal work that Roy undertook with a thoroughness that surprised even himself. But Dutch had overplayed his hand, and in the end, the thing that brought him down was the simplest thing. He had underestimated a quiet man. Cale and Clara were married in the Red Rock Hollow Church in March, the one with the crooked cross. It was a small ceremony, a handful of neighbors, old Hennessy from the general store, who cried and was embarrassed about it. The boy who had stared at Cale on that first afternoon stood in the front row and watched the whole thing with enormous, serious eyes, as if he was memorizing it. Cale stood at the front of that church in a clean shirt. Not a new shirt, but a clean one, with his hat in his hands and his gray eyes on Clara, and if you had looked at his face in that moment, you would have seen a man who was not pretending, who was not performing, who was simply, quietly, completely present in his own life for perhaps the first time. Clara looked back at him with those steady dark eyes, and she smiled. Not the polite smile she gave to customers or neighbors. The real one. The one that was just for him. He would spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of that smile. Some days he fell short. Most days he didn't. And the desert, which had always shown him who he was, showed him this too. A man carrying a pail of water to a garden. A man sitting on a back step in the dark with a woman beside him and a cup of coffee in his hands. A man who had learned, slowly and with great effort and pain, that love is not a reward for being good enough. It is the thing that makes you want to try. What would you have done in his place? Ridden away or stayed? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one.